As we've been walking through these commandments, like I said, we started off with our first commandments being about loving God. They're about our relationship with God, directly with our relationship with God. And then we got to the ones that had to do with us and each other. Because remember, the 10 Commandments can be summed up in 2 overall commandments. Love God, love others. Every one of them falls underneath one of those. Love God, love others. And this morning we're going to be on one of those commandments that this one is another one of those that I think just like a lot of them, I think there's a little bit more to it than sometimes what we sometimes just look at and we just first appoint and assume that's on there. And it may seem straightforward, and there is an aspect of it that is very straightforward. But I think there's also so much more to it than sometimes what we give credit to it. So this week we're on the 7th commandment. And that is, if you look in Exodus chapter 20 and you look at verse 14, we see this next commandment. And it simply says, you must not commit adultery. Now, let's face the facts. These 10 commandments, they're big. I mean, there's a reason why there's only 10 of them, and there's a lot of things that encompass and fall into these things. These things are the big ones, and I can guarantee you, if you were to ask most people in this world, what are the 10 commandments? A lot of people aren't going to be able to give them to you. Even people in the church probably couldn't list off all 10 commandments. But even people outside the church, there's certain ones that they can list off. And I believe, thou shalt not murder is one of them. And thou shalt not commit adultery is another one of those. This is one of those that for some reason is real easy for people. It's very universal. It's easy for people to understand this. But like I said, there's so much more to this than just the actual physical act of adultery. There's so much more to this commandment. And I understand that there's probably most people here could sit here and say most people that you run into in your lives, I don't know. That's a very personal thing. But we know lots of people that maybe have or haven't committed the actual physical act of adultery. But there are many of us that there's others that have not kept this commandment. And it's not just because of the physical act. There's other things that are included in this commandment. And so I just want us to take a moment, just kind of break this down just a little bit, and just kind of actually see what all is actually included in this commandment. Because I said the world will tell us right off the bat, well, as long as I don't actually physically touch somebody else, I'm good. I haven't committed adultery. But like I said, there's more to it. First, if we look at it, and we look at the verb, we go back and we look and we tear it apart and do this analysis on all these words, the verb that's actually used to commit adultery first can be used for both either men or women. Now, that might seem pretty obvious. Most of us would sit there and go, well, duh. But let's face it, we've lived in a world for many, many years that it has not always applied on the same level. You go back to biblical times. You go back to Jesus' time, and it wasn't obvious back then either. And we've lived in a world where, unfortunately, there has been a double standard between men and women. The men were allowed to do it, but the woman wasn't. And it's not here to sit there and say everybody should be able to. Nobody should be doing it. But if we go back, there's a little story that most of us will remember. There was a woman that was caught in the act of adultery in Scripture. And she was dragged out of the home, thrown into the street, and she was actually thrown at the feet of Jesus. And this was nothing but a test to Jesus. And if you remember, this was one where Jesus kind of just sat there and kind of went, squatted down and sat there and wrote in the dirt. And you'll find this story in John chapter 8. And it says, Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives. But early the next morning, he was back again at the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. Now, remind you, they said they brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. I'm pretty sure it takes two people to do the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. Teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer, and so he stood up again and said, all right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. Then he stooped down and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. Like I said in the story, you very quickly go, well, where is the man at? Why wasn't he thrown in the street along with the woman? Why wasn't he being accused? Why wasn't he being threatened to be stoned? Where was he at? And again, it was because a lot of history has had that tendency to allow leeway for either men or for women. And that is not what this verb was ever intended for. It is equal, both men and women. And unfortunately, it is sad when we read this story that so many times today, this story, that particular story, was used for the wrong purposes. So many times people will use this story, and of course, like I said, they try to sit there and say, well, who are you to cast a stone? I can do whatever I want. And that was never the point, that was never the intention of this story. That was not why this story is included in Scripture, is try to use it as an escape to be able to justify all your wrong actions and all your wrongdoings. That's not why it's in there. People have taken it out of context. But it goes to show you that even back in Jesus' day, people were not fully understanding this commandment and following this commandment the way that it was originally intended for. You know, and another aspect that we have to realize is adultery is not just a question of violating another person's property. It's a moral question. And yes, I did just say property. It's not meant to be a sexist thing. Don't worry. I don't want anybody coming up and hitting me up at the end of the service getting ready to whack me upside the head and say, did you just call me a piece of property? That's not what we're talking about here. It is not like you own the piece of property, but the mentality that we can have with this. Because let's face it, when we are joined together in that holy union, we belong to each other. It does not in fact that we own each other, but we belong to each other. And there's a tendency where we can sit there and say, well, I'm offended because you took what I had, or you partook in what was mine. That is mine only. That's not, it goes beyond that. This is a moral issue. There is a moral obligation here. And unfortunately, we also have lived in a world where they have taken the morality out of it to a certain degree. And we're seeing that more and more and more, where the world has taken the morality out of this issue. And and if you think about it, we're supposed to be an evolved society. We're supposed to be more of an open, utopian society. But we've degraded people to a certain degree even more into property than anything. You have touched my property. You've taken this. You've touched this. But there is a moral aspect to it. You see this even in the fact that marriage in its own has been resorted to nothing but a contract. Marriage is not a contract. Marriage is a covenant. And there is a significant difference between a covenant and a contract. And we've gotten down to that point where we go, you know what? You violated this contract. You touched, or you allowed somebody else to touch my property, contract null and void. And it goes beyond that. A covenant goes so far beyond just what a covenant is. But we've taken the morality out of it. And in doing that, we've made it a little easier for people to commit this act, to commit this. You know, Joseph, if we go back and we look at the story of Joseph helps us understand that when we commit adultery, we're not only committing a sin against another person, but we're committing it against God as well. It says in Genesis chapter 39, it says, "No one here has more authority than I. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a sin against God." That is Joseph speaking of Potiphar. That is him speaking, talking to his wife that was trying to seduce him. And he's saying, how can I not only hurt him? I can't do this. He's been nothing but good to me. But it would be a sin against God. This is more than just, we sit here and say this commandment has to do with relationships with each other. These commandments, the ones that have to do with each other, they still involve God. They still involve God in every one of them. This is not just a sin between each other. This is a sin against God. Like I said, and we also have to remember that as well, that while these commandments do fundamentally have to do with how we relate to each other, it's like God ties into the entire thing. He's part of it. He's part of a marriage. He's part of that relationship. Not to mention, and that this has a direct relationship to our morality. And God has everything to do with our morality. God wants us to enjoy our relationships with each other. But he also has expectations and rules that go along with them as well. And while this can be a challenge, by us being obedient to God's desires to keep our marriages pure, we can also find strength and encouragement in doing so. Let me say that again, because this is one of those things that you go, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The world and the world mind, this doesn't make much sense. What you're telling me is that by being obedient, you are helping yourself be obedient. Within the obedience itself is built in some strength. It's built in some help to be able to allow us to continue to be obedient. To be able to find the obedience that we need. It's not just all on our own strength. Our first step is, obviously, we've got to be obedient. But then it's kind of like, it's kind of like physics. It's once an object is in motion, it stays in motion. That's what it helps. We get the ball rolling, we help those things, and it helps us keep things moving. It helps us keep moving in the direction that we need to be going. Proverbs chapter 5, verses 15 through 21 says, "Drink water from your own well. Share your love only with your wife. Why spill the water of your springs in the streets? Having sex with just anyone. You should reserve it for yourselves. Never share it with strangers. Let your wife be a fountain of blessing for you. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. She is a loving deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast satisfy you always. May you always be captivated by her love. Why be captivated, my son, by an immoral woman?" And it goes on and continues to discuss and break down and discuss the relationship between a man and a woman. But the facts are, this particular passage is, the theme is the enjoyment that can come out of the physical connection, the physical acts of marriage helps people avoid temptations. We go back into history in the church, and it has been a history in the church. We don't talk about this subject. We don't talk about this aspect. It's not right. We just, the years I've seen when I would talk with teenagers and their eyes get about this big when this subject comes up. When you start talking about sexuality, eyes get about this big, and they're going, "Are we allowed to talk about this stuff in church?" And I'm going, if you can't talk about this in church, where can you talk about it at? This was created and ordained by God. If we're not teaching this and we're not talking about this and we're not guiding this inside the church, where are you going to learn it from? And that's what we've ran into. We've ran into a world that they're learning about this everywhere else but the church. What it means. Why we even have this act. But God created this for a specific purpose. And it goes beyond just procreation. He made it so that he made it enjoyable. But he made this to help people and help strengthen a relationship between two people, and for that relationship to help avoid the temptations that could come out from the outside. Because let's face it, when you're happy at home, you have a lot less of a wandering eye. And that's just the point blank basis of it. When you're happy at home, and you have a whole lot less of a wandering eye. Now, we're not going to get into the reasons why you may not be happy, but I believe this is one of those things. See, a young man is advised to spend his youth, that energy that he has at home, producing children rather than giving himself to strangers. God's saying, use that and commit yourself to your marriage. Not going out, and that's what it's saying, not going out into the streets and not just running around. And we live in a world, as we sit here and we talk about this, we're living in a world that is, they need to hear that. More than ever, they need to hear that. The proper course of action is to find pleasure in a fulfilling marriage. Instead, we live in a world that wants to play games with our relationships. And you hear and you see that all the time. People start playing with different aspects of their relationships. Whether it's the sexual aspect of a relationship, an emotional level of a relationship, it doesn't really matter. Well, I'm going to hold out on them. I'm going to freeze them out until I get my way. That's doing nothing but playing games with things. That's playing games with something that God has ordained. And again, we can't do that. There's a lot of things that we have to do in this relationship. It all goes back to the same thing. You can't sit there and say, men, or say, women, you must honor and obey your husbands. But why? It's because the husband loves his bride as Christ loves the church. There's a dual responsibility there. So as we sit here and we say these things and we make these statements, we got to remember there's always two people in this relationship. There's always two people. That we're supposed to be pouring ourselves into this marriage, not playing games with each other. Because let's face it, how many times have you ever heard of a marriage that was struggling where both people were pouring themselves in wholeheartedly? Truly, wholeheartedly into a relationship. Sometimes one person can be pouring themselves in wholeheartedly and the other person's not. Both people have to be pouring wholeheartedly into their relationship, but not just with their relationship with each other, their relationship with God. I've always used this analogy, and I love this picture. They sit there and say, ooh, it's a love triangle. And you just go, oh no, that doesn't sound right. But think about it. You've got a triangle. And on this triangle you put you, your spouse, your loved one, and you put God up at the top. At any point, if I'm pouring myself into my relationship with God, and I'm the only one doing it, am I growing any closer to my spouse? Not growing one bit closer to my spouse. If I'm here, my spouse is pouring themselves into their relationship with God, am I getting any closer to them? No. We're keeping that same distance. It's not until both people start pouring themselves into their relationship with God. And the closer they get to God, the closer they get to each other. It takes both people pouring themselves into that relationship. We live in a world, and again, where so many people would sit there and wonder and go, well, it's my job, it's my responsibility to fix my marriage. To fix that marriage. It's both people. And it can't be fixed unless both people are there and both people are open and willing to what God has for them. We've taken God out of everything else, and we've taken God out of marriages. And then we wonder why our marriages are crumbling and falling apart. Why divorce rates are through the roof. And it's because we've taken God out of them. He's not in our marriages like He's supposed to be. He's not in our relationships like we're supposed to have. Paul tells us in Ephesians chapter 5, he says, "And further, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. For wives, this means submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For a husband is the head of his wife as Christ is the head of the church. He is the Savior of his body, the church. And as the church submits to Christ, so you wives should submit to your husbands in everything. For husbands, this means love your wives, just as Christ loved the church. He gave up his life for her, to make her holy and clean, washed by the cleansing of God's word. He did this to present her to himself as a glorious church, without a spot or wrinkle or any other blemish. Instead, she will be holy and without fault. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as they love their own bodies. For a man who loves his wife actually shows love for himself. No one hates his own body and feeds and cares for it, just as Christ cares for the church. And we are members of his body. As the scriptures say, a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. This is a great mystery, but it is an illustration of the way Christ and the church are one. So again I say, each man must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband." Okay. Love God, love others. Even within our marriage, it's love God, love others. But I want us to look at even a bigger picture of this. Because let's face it, these commandments, like I said, they're big. They encompass a lot of things. And this commandment, I think we can look at it, we can take it even to a bigger prospect. That it's more, like I said, it's more than just the actual physical act of going out and cheating, having an adulterous relationship outside and within your marriage. Sexual purity is the underlying principle of this command. Simple, straight across the board, sexual purity. This commandment is applicable to all kinds of sexual immorality. This is found in the heart and occurs before any outward act. Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. "But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." We're living in a world that we're surrounded by it. And I don't care what age you are. I don't care if you're single, if you're married, if you're divorced, whatever it is, we are still in a world. We still have a sexual aspect to our lives. No matter where you sit at in your world, you still have that aspect of your life. And this commandment is telling us to remain sexually pure. But we live in a world where we're bombarded by it. You know, you see it everywhere. You have access to it everywhere. And it's even easier today with these. I mean, these things right here make it so easy to fall into that snare, into that trap. So easy. I try to over and over and over and over again when I would be talking with teenagers to warn teenagers about the dangers of that. And it's so easy. I said, and sometimes it's innocence. It doesn't necessarily even mean that you went out looking for it. That it found you. But what do you do when you find it? I've always shared this with my teenagers. So you get online and you do a search. They're doing a report for school. They're doing something and they need a picture. And they will type something in and they'll be looking for pictures. And something will just scroll across their screen that has absolutely nothing to do with what they were looking for. They were looking for something to work on a school project. And they find images that come across that they just should not have ever seen. You know, and I shared this with my teenagers. You know, I said, and every one of us has had those experiences, whether we meant to or not, whether we went looking for it or not. There's been a lot of times things things pop up, we see things. You know, I always shared with my teens, said, this is a moment, I would come and say, this is a moment of vulnerability for me. You know, I said, I remember the first time that I saw what you would classify as pornography. I said, I was in a bookstore, back in the children's department of a bookstore, because my mom would spend a lot of hours shopping in the mall, and I spent hours in the bookstore. And I'm back there, and someone had decided to go up to the magazine racks and pull a magazine off the top shelf, go back to the back store of the bookstore, rip the plastic off of it, and then decided to leave that magazine in the children's department. And as I'm browsing, looking through books and come across this, hello? And like I heard somebody say years ago, that image is burned into your memory. You know, and innocence happens. I'll never lie, we laugh about it. When we went to Peru, we're sitting there, and I was bunking in with one of our other pastors on the district, his son. And we're coming back, and we get to the hotel, and we had a stopping point between where we were at in Lima, and we get to this hotel, and the guy comes in, and the little guy was showing us our room, and he's doing everything, and he goes ahead and he reaches up and turns the fan on in the room, and he decides to turn the TV on. I turn around to some very unpleasant things being shown on the TV. And I'm leaping across this room trying to get this turned off before this teenage boy sees this on the screen. It was an accident. But what do we do with it when it happens? What do we do? Do we allow it to affect us? Do we go looking for it? Or do we immediately seek God at that point in time? It happens. But we need to try and do our absolute best to keep ourselves pure. Because if we can't even fully protect ourselves in the world that we're living in now, and we're not intentionally looking for it, imagine how far down a path we could go when they're intentionally looking for things. This commandment condemns all sexual acts outside of the marriage bond. Unless the natural desires that attract us to the members of the opposite sex are channeled exclusively toward a loving marriage relationship, the temptation to engage in sexual immorality can easily overpower our self-control. This weakness is the focus of the seventh commandment. But I want to take this even further. Let's take this commandment even further and see how this can affect us. As I said earlier, we've seen a decline in the commitment to marriage and family, and the resulting decrease in spouses' loyalty and devotion to each other have contributed heavily to the steady increase in extramarital liaisons. A growing segment of our society has adopted the practice of casual live-in relationships. Ours is a throwaway society. Intimate personal relationships are routinely discarded. People are the big losers in our fast-track society with this touted sexual revolution. They receive less and less parental guidance. In the United States, fathers spend an average of only a few minutes per day in one-on-one contact with each child. Is it any wonder that we see a rapidly expanding subculture of alienated and disaffected children? Society is losing sight of what families are all about. This even falls within the family. Are we teaching our children, like I said earlier, there's things that we're not to talk about within the church, but we're not teaching them and they learn it from somewhere else. I was one of those children, again, one of those moments. I didn't hear and learn a thing, never was told a thing from my parents. Everything that I learned about the opposite sex, I learned from school. Everything. I either learned it from reading or from TV or from school. Learned absolutely nothing. I did not learn what it meant. We didn't talk about it in church. We can't talk about those things. I wasn't being mentored. I wasn't being guided in those things. We need to be making sure that even if you look at this commandment, we need to be making sure that we're helping train and raise up our young men and women, that they can fully, truly understand what this commandment means and how to fulfill this commandment. Because sometimes we're not doing the best job of that. Because I said, this commandment may seem like it's just about a spouse not, sleeping around. But let's face the facts. You could take this and this keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger on how this affects our relationships and the world we live in. And if you look at our world we live in, this doesn't happen overnight. I said our country has gotten to the point in the position where it's gotten worse and worse and worse. And it's taken decades for it to get where it's at right now. And it's not going to be an over-the-night solution for those things. You see, when you remove God from your lives, you get the world we live in. The more you take him out, the worse things are going to get. So I kind of ask you this morning, as we wrap up this morning, you may not be yourself having any problems. Your marriage may be healthy and strong, and you've never encountered any of those problems. Maybe it doesn't even relate and doesn't even make a difference to you right now. Like I said, some of us, maybe we no longer have a spouse that we're having to worry about having an adulterous relationship with. But this commandment goes and speaks about all sexuality. So I think first and foremost, you have to ask yourselves, am I keeping myself sexually pure? And this is a personal thing. This is a very personal thing. Because nobody will, this is closed doors personal stuff. But God knows. And here this morning, we can allow God to do a work in our life. We can have a conversation with God without having the person next to us need to know. Maybe it doesn't matter to you. Maybe it does. But it doesn't have to stop you from having that one-on-one conversation with God. But you also have to ask, I want us to ask ourselves, are we helping encourage, helping strengthen, helping model what it should look like? Not just saying don't do this, but are we helping model and explain and help demonstrate what it means, what it should look like? I have to ask and say, am my wife and I modeling what a healthy marriage and relationship should look like for our kids? Having conversations with them, talking to them, but showing them at the same time. Showing them that I love my wife as Christ loves the church. And that my wife loves me in the way that she loves me is by honoring and respecting me. That there's a mutual relationship here. I don't dominate, she doesn't dominate. It's not one of those things. It's about loving and serving God. So no matter where you're at in a relationship, I think we can still find something in this commandment that could still be applicable to us today. Because again, remember, there's always that sexual aspect to our lives as well. And if we're not healthy in that area, we may not be in a relationship right now. It can affect our relationship with others and future others. Not only mentioned, just like Joseph, remember, we are sinning against God. We're not just sinning against ourselves or another person. We're sinning against God at the exact same time. So this morning, we're just going to sing here through a song here for just a moment. And if you need to have that personal conversation with God, have it. It's completely up to you. You don't have to come to the altars. You can sit where you're at. I get and I understand how this can be such a very personal thing. It was personal when it started, and it's still personal right now. Or maybe you just need God saying, how can I help model this a little bit better? How can I model a healthy relationship a little bit better? This is between you and God. It's completely up to you this morning. So just open up what God has for you this morning. How it affects our lives and the lives of others, how it affects our relationship with you. But Lord, not only do I pray that if someone needs a change in heart, a change in life, Lord, that they reach out for that amazing grace. But Lord, may we also seek your strength. So Lord, we do live in a world where this is constantly surrounding us. Lord, just be able to protect us, strengthen us, encourage us, strengthen our marriages and our relationships. Lord, we want to be able to remain pure in every way, not just for each other, but for you, Lord. Lord, because fundamentally, Lord, we love you, and we know that you have our best interests at heart, and we want to be obedient to what you have for us. Lord, just be with us. Strengthen us, encourage us, protect our loved ones from those that would try to take advantage and try to tempt us. But Lord, also help us have a mentoring and guiding heart, that when those times come up in a young person's life, that we're there to be able to help give that guidance, to give that encouragement, that direction, that openness this world needs. That when that young child accidentally sees something that they shouldn't see, they have someone to be able to go to, someone to help guide and direct them, to encourage them. Lord, just be with each and every one of us. Protect us, be with us. Lord, be with us, be with those that weren't able to be here this morning, Lord. Help bring them strength and encouragement.